title, The Man Who Died in His Mind, based on the true case of Reverend Carmichael and Gideon Browning, 1889, The Hypnotist and the Reverend. This story sounds fake, but it's real. And it starts with a murder that, according to everyone who witnessed it, never should have been possible. In 1889, in the small town of Northam, England, Reverend William Carmichael was known for two things: his booming Sunday sermons and his obsession with the power of the human mind. Carmichael wasn't your typical preacher. He was fascinated, borderline obsessed, with the new craze sweeping through Europe at the time, mesmerism, or what we'd now call hypnosis. He believed that under hypnosis, a person could unlock hidden parts of the soul. His parishioners thought it was harmless curiosity, until he met Gideon Browning. Gideon was a drifter, early 30s, wiry, unshaven, always wearing the same torn gray coat. He claimed he could put a man to sleep with just a whisper. Carmichael, intrigued, invited Gideon to his parsonage one autumn evening to demonstrate. What happened that night would become one of the strangest murder cases in British history. According to Reverend Carmichael's testimony later in court, Gideon began his demonstration by lighting 3 candles and placing them in a triangle on the table. He asked the Reverend to sit opposite him, hands flat, eyes open. Then, in a low voice, Gideon started whispering, "Your mind is not your own." At first, Carmichael said he felt calm, but then something changed. His body went rigid, his heartbeat slowed, and Gideon's voice, now echoing strangely in his head, said, "When you awaken, someone will be gone." That's all Carmichael remembered. The next thing he knew, he was standing over the body of Samuel Wren, his longtime church caretaker, holding a bloodied candlestick. Wren's skull had been crushed. Carmichael's hands were trembling, but not from guilt. He had no idea how it happened. He swore he'd blacked out. Gideon Browning was nowhere to be found. Now, here's where it gets weird. When police arrived, they found signs that someone else had been in the room. A second chair pulled out, footprints in the dust, one of the 3 candles missing. But every door was locked from the inside. And Reverend Carmichael wasn't making any sense. He kept mumbling, "He said the soul can be stolen." At first, authorities assumed it was an open and shut case. A deranged clergyman kills his servant, blames a ghost. But then, 2 witnesses came forward. A housemaid from the neighboring cottage swore she saw a thin man in a gray coat leaving the parsonage that night, walking stiffly, as if half asleep. And another witness, a stable boy, claimed that days later, a man matching Gideon's description boarded a train to Bristol. But here's the kicker. He was speaking in a perfect imitation of Reverend Carmichael's voice. The trial that followed became a national obsession. The newspapers called it the murder of the mind. Carmichael insisted he was innocent, that Gideon had hypnotized him into committing the act, or perhaps even transferred his own consciousness into Carmichael's body. It sounded insane, until a court-ordered hypnotist was brought in to examine him. During the session, Carmichael's demeanor changed completely. His accent, his posture, even his handwriting shifted, identical to Gideon Browning's. Experts called it possession by suggestion. The press called it the first documented psychic murder. Whatever it was, Reverend Carmichael was declared unfit to stand trial and was sent to Broadmoor Asylum, where he spent the rest of his life. And Gideon Browning, he was never seen again. But here's the part that still freaks historians out. Years later, in 1903, a caretaker CLO, eaning out Carmichael's cell, found a single object hidden behind a loose brick. A half-burned candle, and etched into the wax, was a name: Gideon, the mind left behind. When Reverend William Carmichael was admitted to Broadmoor Asylum for the criminally insane, he was labeled a clergyman with delusional transference and violent somnambulism. In plain English, he killed a man in his sleep while awake. Broadmoor, at the time, was less of a hospital and more of a tomb for the living. Patients who went in rarely came out, but Carmichael wasn't like the others. He spent his days writing. Not letters, not prayers, journals. Page after page of cramped handwriting, filled with strange diagrams and phrases like the triangle of will and the stolen echo. He believed Gideon Browning hadn't just hypnotized him. He believed Gideon had taken part of his consciousness and left a fragment of his own behind. Essentially, Carmichael thought that they were now sharing a mind. Now here's where it gets really unsettling. The asylum staff began noticing odd behavior. Carmichael would sometimes refer to himself in the third person. Gideon doesn't like the light. Gideon wants to go home. At night, other inmates reported hearing him whispering through the walls, two voices overlapping, arguing softly in the dark. One orderly, a man named Peter Dorsey, later described it in his report. He talks to himself as if another man lives inside him. Sometimes he answers himself before he finishes speaking. After 6 months, doctors decided to isolate Carmichael completely. That's when he stopped talking and started drawing. His sketches were disturbing, always the same pattern, a triangle of 3 candles, and inside it, an empty chair. One doctor asked him what the chair meant. Carmichael just smiled and said, "That's where the next one sits." They thought he was rambling, but then, in the spring of 1891, something impossible happened. Another inmate, a former stage hypnotist named Arthur Penrose, was found dead in his cell. The cause of death: massive brain hemorrhage, but no sign of injury. The only thing found near him was a half-burned candle, and under the candle, written faintly in ink, "He's learning to switch again." After that, Carmichael's mental state deteriorated fast. He began claiming Gideon could move between sleeping minds like a parasite, that each time someone dreamed near him, Gideon could step through the gap. By 1893, Broadmoor staff sealed his journals away as occult delusion artifacts. They were locked in the asylum archive for decades. But in 1974, nearly 80 years later, a group of historians from Oxford were allowed to examine them. One of them, Dr. Helen Ware, made a discovery that sent chills through the entire research team. Inside the final notebook, dated a few weeks before Carmichael's death, was an unfinished letter. It read, "To whomever finds this, he is not gone. He changes faces the way fire changes shape. He said the mind is only a room, and all he needs is the key. Tonight, I feel the door opening again." The date of the letter, October 9th, 1894. The next morning, guards found Carmichael dead in his bed. No struggle, no trauma, no sign of heart failure. But his eyes were wide open, and his pupils were so dilated that, according to the coroner, it was as if he had seen something unspeakable at the moment he died. Dr. Ware's team concluded the journals were nothing more than the ramblings of a deteriorating mind. Except for one detail no one could explain. Tucked between 2 pages was an old photograph, sepia-toned, faintly burned at the edges. It showed Reverend Carmichael standing outside Broadmoor, beside a thin man in a gray coat. The problem? According to every official record, Gideon Browning had vanished 5 years before that photograph was taken. The frequency of the dead. In 2012, a neuroscientist named Dr. Marcus Ellery stumbled across a box of dusty Broadmoor asylum records during a research trip to Oxford. Inside that box were Reverend Carmichael's journals, sealed in wax and labeled, "Unfit material, do not display." Ellery wasn't a historian. He studied sleep disorders and dissociative brain states, how the mind can fracture under extreme hypnosis. So naturally, the Carmichael case caught his attention. And what started as a curiosity turned into an obsession. At first, Ellery thought the idea of mind transference was laughable, but then he noticed something strange in the pages of those old journals. Carmichael's handwriting shifted patterns. On some pages, his letters slanted right, on others, left. Even the pressure of the pen changed. Ellery ran a graphological analysis, basically a handwriting fingerprint test, and the results came back with a note from the software. Detected 2 distinct motor identities. In other words, it was as if 2 different people had been writing with the same hand. That's when Ellery decided to go further. He recreated the triangle and candle experiment described in Carmichael's first journal entry. He brought in a volunteer, an insomniac patient with a high susceptibility to hypnosis. They sat in a soundproof room, dimly lit, 3 candles arranged in a triangle. Ellery read from Carmichael's original transcript. "Your mind is not your own. It only sleeps where it is told to." Within minutes, the volunteers' breathing slowed. Their eyes fluttered. Then they whispered something that froze Ellery cold. "When you awaken, someone will be gone." Those were Carmichael's exact words from 1889. Ellery stopped the test immediately. He assumed the volunteer had read about the case beforehand, but they swore they hadn't, and that was only the beginning. 2 weeks late, the volunteer, let's call him Daniel, reported blacking out at random times. When he woke, he couldn't remember where he'd been or what he'd done. One night, Ellery got a call at 3 a.m. from Daniel's roommate. Daniel was standing in the kitchen, whispering to himself. But his voice wasn't his own. The roommate recorded it on his phone. The voice on the tape was older, lower, and spoke with a Victorian cadence. It said, "He's learning to switch again." Ellery panicked. He stopped the experiment and took Daniel to the hospital for a brain scan. But when he looked at the data, something impossible appeared on the monitor. In the brain's electrical activity, there was a second pattern, a faint, rhythmic pulse overlapping Daniel's normal brain waves. A neurologist reviewing the scan said it looked like residual activity from a second consciousness. Ellery didn't tell her the rest of the story. He named the anomaly the Browning frequency. Then came the part that made Ellery quit academia altogether. A week after the scan, Daniel vanished. His phone was left on his desk, still recording audio from the night before. The last few seconds of the file captured Daniel whispering, terrified. He said the mind is only a room. Pause. And he found the key. Then, silence. But at the very end, right before the file cuts out, you can hear another voice whisper softly, "Thank you, Reverend." Authorities assumed Daniel had run away. Ellery, however, turned in his resignation letter the next morning. He moved to a remote house in Wales, where he still lives off the grid. But there's one detail he never told the police. When he was packing up his lab equipment, he noticed something on his desk, a small wax object he didn't remember owning, a half-burned candle with a name etched faintly into the side, Gideon